This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is calling for the recognition of the Palestinian House, which will reject the Oslo Accords. They emphasize the need for a national emergency leadership to combat Zionist American aggression. The front has also urged unity against the ongoing genocide in Gaza, calling for the rejection of Western arrangements and Palestinians seeking U.S. intervention. This call comes as Palestinians are seeking the next step after the battle of Operation Al-Aqsa flood, which will ensure their liberation and their return to their land. We're now joined by Alain Alameddine, a supporter of the Palestinian One Democratic State initiative and a member of the Lebanese political party Citizens in a State. A very good morning to you and welcome to Radio 786.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
What exactly is the One Democratic State initiative?
So this is a Palestinian initiative. A long time ago, before the Nakba, and even when the PLO was formed after the Nakba, the Palestinian people adopted the means of struggle, for example, mainly armed resistance, but they also adopted a political objective, which was the elimination of the Zionist state and the establishment of a democratic Palestinian state from the river to the sea. So unfortunately, this was lost at Oslo, where we opted for the so-called two-state solution, which is not a solution at all. And other concepts, for example, the 1948 so-called Palestinian political parties speak of just trying to have equal rights within the Jewish state. So the ODS initiative, One Democratic State initiative, is trying to revive the historical Palestinian position, which is of creating a secular and democratic Palestinian state on all of Palestine without any compromise with Zionism.
How practical is that, given the expansion of the settler colonial entity that is Israel at the moment?
Well, that's a very good question. The balance of power at the moment, of course, is not in favor of such liberation, but there is no other option. It's like someone who has cancer. It's very difficult, complex, risky. It might even not work. But when someone has cancer, they cannot just take, a couple of pills and hope it will work out. They cannot settle for a two-state thing where, part of their body will have cancer and the other part not. The only solution is to eradicate the cancer. And this needs to be based on a very accurate and precise understanding of the situation. The cancer is not the presence of someone who is Jewish in Palestine. The cancer is not for example, specifically Netanyahu, like many people today say, oh, Netanyahu needs to go to prison and then we can have someone else. No, the cancer is settler colonialism and we will not be free, neither in Palestine nor outside it, as long as this cancer still exists.
And we see this misapprehension come to the fore once again since October the 7th in the framing of this to be, as always, a two different people at war with each other, and perhaps somewhere in there as a premise is a religion. This, of course, has been debunked, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on what has been flagrant nonsense, really, that has influenced this understanding of what again, I use this term very reservedly, what some would describe as a conflict. But certainly we're dealing here with 1945 and even, beyond that, where there was a British colonization of Palestine, which the British thought it was theirs to give for an original sin that was committed by white Europeans, of course, in Germany, as it were, and Poland and elsewhere. And Palestinians have had to bear the brunt for that for the last 75 years. And why is that historical context important to understanding a realization from the river to the sea?
Well, I agree with what you're saying. For example, when people frame it as a conflict, it kind of implies that there is some kind of moral equivalence, that there is some kind of military equivalence, whereas, as you said, it's fully a white European settler colonial movement, where it would be funny if it weren't a genocide, but people who had nothing to do with Palestine, like the British, who lived thousands of kilometers away, decided that they would give the land of Palestine to other people who come from, some from Yemen, some from Poland, some from Britain themselves, some from Canada. So it's really, imagine someone living thousands of kilometers away from your house, giving control over it to other people who also live thousands of kilometers away. It's almost comical. So this context is crucial to understanding what is happening there. It's not just a war. It's not a conflict. It's settler colonialism. It's if we were to compare it to two individuals, it's not a fight. It's a rape. And framing it as the rape of Palestine is very important to understanding the actual solution and the legitimacy of the armed Palestinian resistance.
12 minutes after 8 o'clock. The growth in the discussion, or the evolution of the discussion from a two-state solution to, just calling, for instance, for a ceasefire. Ceasefire is important to bring reprieve to the ongoing carnage that we have right now. But ceasefire surely cannot be the solution, right?
Yes, of course. It's just a temporary milestone in a global fight towards full liberation.
Because going back to the ceasefire is going back to what has become the normative for Palestinians.
Absolutely. I think that in this context, what happened on October 7 is actually historic, because Zionism is founded on a claim that the Jews of the world are only safe in what they call Israel. And I think that October 7th proved that this is not true. No matter what we think about it, even if someone thinks that, this is a horrible terrorist attack that we condemn, even if one thinks that, then one must reckon with the fact that October 7th proved that settler colonialism does not make the Jews in Palestine safe. And this broke the status quo that we had before. And it's very important not to go back to the status quo. The people in Palestine need to understand that if they came from abroad, the solution for them is simply to return from where they came from. And the people who were born there have a choice. Either they want to support this political program for settler colonialism, and they want to choose to become rapists, in which case they are legitimate targets for the Palestinian resistance. And the ceasefire is not something that should accommodate that rape. Or they decide to say, no, I was born in Palestine. This is Palestine. I am against the existence of a state exclusive to Jews. I declare that I am a Palestinian and part of the Palestinian struggle for liberation.
In terms of the symbolism of what defines certainly this colonization, I want to let me phrase this question in this way. I was at a demonstration very recently at a company in South Africa that has owners that are very vocally in support of Israel, and in fact are donors and funders for Israel, and was regarded as the biggest the biggest fundraising activity outside of Israel for that settler colonial entity. And so that is why in South Africa there's a call for this company, of course, to be boycotted. And one of the things that I found quite astounding, it would be the responses from people that are either protesting and those that are observers to the protest, the ordinary public, that are the passerbys. And there seems to still be quite ingrained in largely white South Africans and largely white people that feel that Israel has first of all a right to exist, that Hamas is the problem, and the framing of this is that this is a land for a chosen people, that there is a very fundamental connection to this particular claim. Of course, I can dismiss it very easily and very comfortably, but I'm wondering what your sense is about how committed there are people certainly to a claim like this. And of course, one of my obvious question is what sort of God that you believe in, or what sort of a religion that you do ascribe to, justifies what we're seeing at the moment in Gaza. And I don't think I'll ever get an answer to that question. But why do you think there are these Zionists that are even that live outside of the settler colonial entity that are so committed in deed and in cause to this idea that this is a land for a chosen people, when clearly all the hallmarks of history tell a different story?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. I think there are several aspects to take into consideration. One of them, when the Zionist propaganda is very well woven, their words are well chosen, their arguments are well picked. They make logical fallacies that are deliberate and very intricate. And it's very important. This is actually part of our work at the One Democratic State Initiative, to try and deconstruct the Zionist discourse, and also to create or reaffirm a very specific Palestinian narrative that counters Zionist so-called legitimacy or alleged legitimacy at its core. So, for example, when they speak of the right of Israel to exist, they conflate two things. One of them is the right of this particular state to exist, and one of them is the right of the people that make up this state to exist. And the two are very different, because states do not have rights. It is people who have rights. For example, I live in Lebanon. 100 years ago, there was no state of Lebanon, and it has no such right. And we actually had different points of view in Lebanon about whether there should be several states in Lebanon, whether Lebanon should be part of the Syrian state or not, whether it should be independent or not, whether it should be part of a global Arab state or not. So Lebanon has no intrinsic right to exist. Israel is no exception. It is even less right for it to exist, because it is a state that defines itself as exclusive to Jews. So just like I don't want a state that is exclusive to Arabs or to Muslims or to whomever, I refuse the existence of a state that's exclusive to Jews. On the other side, the people have a right to exist. And when we say that a settler who came from Ethiopia or Ukraine or wherever can simply live in Ukraine or South Africa, I'm not denying his right to exist. I am affirming the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination in their own land. If this Ukrainian wants to live in Palestine, then the normal thing would be to go to the Palestinian embassy and try to get a visa to Palestine, and then he would be welcome to come, just like we have Turks in Germany or Indians in the US or Mexicans in South Africa or whatever. So it's very important to get this. When we talk about the state of Israel and that it has no right to exist, it's not a call to genocide. It's actually a call to transition from a state exclusive to some to a Palestinian state of all its citizens.
And the necessity then to achieve that, of course, calls for the dismantling of not just a settler colonial entity, but a dismantling of the Zionist narrative and the political project that is Zionism. How interwoven, do you think Zionism has become in the discourse, and more than just the discourse, but in every facet certainly of Palestinian life at the moment, that makes it a little complicated, more so than most, to unhinge or to break down?
It's definitely not an easy task. I mean, we even need to be careful to the terms we use. For example, we have become used to speaking of the two-state solution. But two states is not a solution. Two states perpetuates settler colonialism, and it's a two-state problem or a two-state proposal, but it's not a two-state solution. So we should even be careful about not using the words that the the settlers are using. For example, we speak of a peace process. No, actually, the peace process is what we are proposing. It's the dismantling of this settler colonial state. This is the peace process. Trying to perpetuate the rape is a rape process, not a peace process. So, as you said, Zionism has entered our discourse. This has been done on purpose by an enemy that is very sly and that is determined to change the way we speak so as to change the way we think. And we need to be very careful about this. We need to think really carefully about every single word we use because the narrative is part of the fight.
Yeah, and that narrative and again the language is terribly important, which is why I want to talk about countering what's been called identitarianism, or the identity of the narrative, as it were, of being Palestinian, and the opportunity certainly for the countering of hegemonic discourses. I want to emphasize and talk about the necessity to call it, of course, what it is, and how in the 21st century, in the year 2023, we still sit with a settler colonial entity, that colonization is still palatable, it would appear, for the international community. And again, I use that relative because I don't want to make the mistake of people like Rishi Sunak that says the UK is a friend of Israel, where perhaps, yes, the UK government may well be the friend of Israel, but it is the people on the street that have come to show where their allegiances lie. And so I'm wondering what your sense is about what it would take to get rid of the settler colonial entity, as it were, and how this sort of conversation sparks alarm among those that are pro-Israel. You know, those that say, you see, this is what they want to do. They want to drive us into the sea, and for them, you know, they don't quite want to believe that there should be a state of Israel, as it were, and thus Israel is always in an existential crisis, which justifies its paranoia and its campaign, for instance, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere. What is your take about how we begin to think more strategically about the necessity to do away with an occupation in the 21st century?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think that it's crucial to really understand what we are fighting. Like you framed it at the beginning, and I really agree with the framing. You called it a US Zionist aggression. Israel is not just a standalone state that we are, fighting in isolation from the rest of the world. I think that if one of the things that were revealed is that there is a global project that includes European municipalities and interior ministries, that includes the capitalist armament industry in the US, that includes meta algorithms, that includes so-called Arabic leaders. And so we are really fighting a global capitalist network that has an interest in imperialism taking place. This means that the Palestinian liberation movement should be supported by people from all over the world. And I'm not just talking about solidarity. I'm talking about a stance of self-defense. So when I, as a Lebanese, side with Palestine, it is not that I am a nice person in solidarity with my neighbors. I am taking part in the freeing of my own country from dangers that threaten it. So to give a small example, not a small example, actually a big example. This concept that all the Jews of the world form a single people and that this people is only safe if they live on a land of their own. Well, we have the same concept in Lebanon, where, for example, historically Maronites have said, oh, but we are not Arabs, we are different from the others, and so we should have a state of our own. This is very similar to the Zionist discourse. And this has caused civil wars. Today we have, for example, in Lebanon, the same with, not just today, for tens of years, even more. The Druze who live on their own in the mountain, there have even been calls to have a separate Druze state, and Israel has backed such efforts in the past. So this is, again, something that fragments our society. We have the same with the Shiites who say, oh, but we need to fight Israel. The others do not want us to fight Israel, so we will have our own army, our own armament, our own banks, our own media, our own hospitals, our own. And so we are, Lebanon is being fragmented into like very small Israels, if you like, very small states that are, but not even states, like systems that are exclusive to their own people. And this is not just limited to Lebanon. This identitarian concept, as you accurately named it, is also affecting the very states that have created Israel. So, for example, I was reading the other day that 45% of US voters, 45%, so almost half of US voters, think that it is time for the US to break into two countries on identitarian grounds. Those who favor abortion and do not favor gun rights should be fragmented from those who do the opposite, believe in the opposite. So this identitarian concept that people of a single identity should live in a state of their own is breaking up societies worldwide. And I think it's good that people are rising for Palestine. We're seeing increasing numbers of people in the so-called West taking a stand with Palestine. What I would like to see, and what we are actually working on as the ODS initiative in partnership with other actors all over the world, including, by the way, in South Africa, is two things. First, an understanding that this identitarian concept is not limited to Palestine and that it is fragmenting all societies in the world. For example, you mentioned that this racism was a sleeping giant that was awakening in South Africa. So it's good to have awareness of this. And second, that our efforts to fight this should be organized. So we should have political movements, political parties that identify identitarianism as the danger it is and that propose the antithesis to it, just like we're proposing a transition to a secular democratic Palestinian state in Palestine, the establishment of states in other parts of the world that do not view people as identitarian tribes, but as one whole society, regardless of one's individual or collective identities.
Yeah. How crucial is it to by having this conversation about a one Palestinian sovereign state, which you do have the local indigenous population deciding what its future is going to be and what sort of system it wants, what sort of government it wants, how it will deal with the breaking of a settler colonial entity in the way that South Africa had also had, its Damascus moment in the early 90s when apartheid fell and came to an end, and you had essentially a one person, one vote scenario that led, of course, to a majority black government being elected to power, and that has been the default position for the 30 years that followed. It was a moment that the world celebrated. It wasn't an easy one. We had what's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, at which point persons went there to say, I've committed so and so crime and I want to seek atonement. Others had been sanctioned even further criminally or otherwise for whatever crimes had been committed as a form of restorative justice. But that restorative justice seems to have had limitations in South Africa. This is the point that I want to raise in whatever future scenario we quite look, what we're imagining it could potentially look like. And that is what many believe here in South Africa to have been the subversion of the true extent of reparations and restorative justice, because the vast amount of land and good land, and as well as the structure of the economy, for instance, have not yet fully transformed. So yes, people are now allowed to go to beaches, people are now allowed to move around freely, are now allowed to vote, are now allowed to have all these libertarian rights and so on. But the structures of what makes life, the land and the ownership of the land and the transformation of the land, as well as the economic structures that inform that, is still wholly controlled by a handful of people, a lot of them being what we call beneficiaries of apartheid. And so my very long-winded question essentially is the following: that if we imagine this one true Palestinian state in which there is no one homogeneous grouping of people that is fundamentally structured on, as you call it, this identitarianism that we see in the world at the moment, how do we embark on this process without necessarily forgetting the necessity to fundamentally let it be one that is a just one, and not necessarily talk about, okay, so there is some sort of a Palestinian state, but the ownership of the land and the resources still remain with those that currently are the occupiers, for instance?
I understand. So, as you said, South Africa can serve as both a good and a bad example, like an example of what should happen and an example of what we should be careful of. When it is said that Israel is a so-called Jewish state, so this includes many things. It includes the gerrymandering that affects the voting. It includes the use of Jewish imagery, like in the flag or the army. It includes the laws, but it also includes many other things. One of them, for example, is the curriculum, where we have two curriculums in so-called Israel, one for Jews and one for non-Jews. It includes the apartheid in roads and water distribution in municipality funds. So, but it also includes, as you said, the distribution of capital. Israel is a capitalist country. This is fundamental to it, although it was founded on so-called leftist claims, which is also comical if it weren't that criminal. It is fundamentally a capitalist country, and the capital is part of these colonial relations of power that make it what it claims to be, a state that is exclusive to some and exclusive of others. So what should happen, it's something that the Palestinian liberation movement should have done long while ago, but it did not happen for reasons we can understand. It's something that should be done today, which is an analysis of these colonial relations of power. We should really understand how are such relations of power included in all the elements I've mentioned, including particularly the one you've mentioned, which is the distribution of wealth and capital. And accordingly, a political program for its antithesis, which should include a redistribution of capital or fundamental changes in this domain. There should be a very definite Palestinian liberation plan for what tomorrow's Palestine would look like in order to guarantee it is really a democratic state. So one man, one vote could be part of this, but it's definitely not the solution. It's only part of it, and maybe even a small part if we take into consideration that the actual relations of power are not determined by voting.
Alain Alameddine, thank you very much, certainly, for your time and your input this morning. I do appreciate it. The support of the Palestinian One Democratic State Initiative and a member of the Lebanese political party, Citizens in a State.
The podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.